Um, well, let's get started. So, buenas tardes or good afternoon. And I really want to welcome all of you to our first Global Health Tuesday seminar for the 22 and 23 academic year, which we have entitled Connecting Climate Change, Infectious Diseases, and Animal Behavior. I'm Jorge Osorio, and I'm the director of the Global Health Institute, which is the institute that hosts these monthly seminars. And I don't know how much you know about the Global Health Tuesdays webinars, but we feature investigators and practitioners from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and across the world. The speakers showcase the complexity of global health challenges and the many kinds of expertise that are needed to address them. And by sharing their experiences, these guests provide insights into global health, encourage conversation, and help connect colleagues locally and globally. Before we begin, I'd like to encourage you all to put your questions into the chat, as we'll have as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. And for tonight, I'd really like to welcome a very great panel of UW professors who are at the forefront of research in infectious diseases, climate, and animal behavior. Our moderator would be Professor Tony Goldberg, who is professor at the Pathobiological Sciences. I will introduce tonight's panelists. Dr. Goldberg's research and teaching focus on ecology, epidemiology, and evolution of infectious diseases, and by understanding how pathogens are emerged, evolve, and are transmitted, he looks to improve the health and well-being of animals and humans. So please welcome Tony and the group of panelists. Thank you so much. So I think, Tony, you go ahead, you are on mute.
Tony, you're still muted. Oh, there you go.
Okay, there we go. Sorry, it was giving me an error. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Dr. Osorio. And it's an honor to be able to moderate this distinguished panel of professors. I don't know how many of you have played the COVID era passing the time game, 7 or 6 degrees of climate change based on 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You know, how many steps does it need to take from one actor to Kevin Bacon? With climate change, it's the same idea, but how many steps does it take from anything in the world to get the climate change? So, you know, pick your thing. You know, the price of you know, corn in Thailand. But with human health, and animal population dynamics, there's actually a lot fewer steps needed than the typical 6. So we're very fortunate to have 3 experts in 3 different aspects of the relationship between climate change and health. Our first panelist who will be talking to us is Jonathan Patz, who is Vilas Distinguished Professor and John P. Holton Endowed Chair for Health and the Environment in the Nelson Institute and the School of Medicine and Public Health. And Jonathan's specialty is exploring the realm of climate change and environmental health. After Jonathan, we will hear from Lyric Bartholomay, a professor in the School of Veterinary Medicine and director of the Midwest Center for Excellence in Vector-borne Diseases, which is a CDC-funded center here on campus. And finally, we'll hear from Ben Zuckerberg, who is a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, and who studies the effects of climate change on animal populations, both here in Wisconsin and elsewhere, and how they're adapting. So the format, if everyone would please make sure you're muted, and if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. That way we can read them off in order. So we're going to have each of the panelists give a short presentation to introduce their take on this issue, and then we'll open up the questions and some lively discussion. So I will now turn it over to Jonathan Patz.
Great. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Jorge. You know, I've been working on climate change and health for so long and have lectured all over campus that I promise I'm only going to show you some brand new findings from a brand new paper that came out just a few months ago. So I'm going to share my screen, and that should look good, right? Tony, you see the screen there? It looks good?
Looks good.
Great, thanks. So this is a paper that came out from a team at the University of Hawaii, and I was their health consultant. But unfortunately, it did not get me a trip to Hawaii. But we did get this paper out in Nature Climate Change. And you know, we've known for a long time the many pathways through which climate affects our health. But this group conducted a system-wide review, a systematic review, and to really dive in and look at the literature. And they looked at these 10 different aspects related to climate change. One is warming. Others related to oceans include you know, warming of sea surface temperature, storms, sea level rise, extremes of the water cycle, heavier precipitation and floods, droughts, heat waves, and fires. And one other one related to climate change is any change in ecosystems and land cover change. So these were the physical attributes to look at in this systematic review. And this very unbusy slide summarizes that essentially this team found over 1,000 unique pathways through which climate affects human pathogens. Most of them are infectious diseases, but not all of them. There are some airborne diseases caused by, for example, fungi, pollen, and also contact dermatitis, poison ivy, things like that. So it's mostly infectious diseases, but it's infectious diseases plus some other non-communicable diseases. These connections across 1,006 pathways identified after searching 77,000 papers, finding 3,200 case examples of a climate disease relationship. That represents 58% of infectious and other human pathogens. So 218 diseases out of 375. So, you know, if you look at, you know, vector-borne diseases up top, Lyric will go more into this, but, you know, what's the difference between a mosquito and us humans, besides the fact that we don't fly? And Tony reassured me that at least 60% of you in the audience do not suck blood. That difference is we're warm-blooded, our body temperature is all the same. A mosquito is cold-blooded, so its body temperature is that of its surroundings. And so a small shift in temperature can make a world of difference in transmission dynamics for vector-borne diseases. And remember, climate change, it's not just about temperature, it's about extremes of the water cycle. So more droughts and more floods. So waterborne diseases and contamination, a big problem. And here in Wisconsin, we already see 7 inches more rainfall on average than we did 50 years ago. So we're getting much more flashier as far as heavy rainfall and water contamination. And airborne diseases, as I mentioned, a few, pollen, imagine floods and then post-flood cleaning up a basement and being exposed to all of the mold and fungus. So all of these issues are climate sensitive. And I want to introduce you to take a screenshot, not of this thing, but if you take a screenshot of this website, you get to see an interactive display of these 1,006 different pathways. And so if you go on that link, you can click on any one of these little noodles spaghetti diagram, and you can see a full display of the different diseases and the papers and everything. And I'll just end by saying as sort of a key point for policymakers and for health professionals that are interested in prevention, if we are dealing with 1,006 pathways through which climate affects our health, we need to get away from just focusing on every single one of these diseases. Yes, we do need to focus on them, but we need to go upstream and look at the root cause and begin to think about how stopping the burning of fossil fuels and reducing our emissions of greenhouse gases that are heating the planet, our health interventions need to happen at that level, as well as the other intermediate levels as we focus on these diseases. So with that, I will wrap this up and hand this off to the next speaker. Thank you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jonathan. So next up, we have Dr. Bartholomay.
All right. Can you see my full screen, or do you see my screen with notes?
Full screen.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. I would say that today we'll really showcase a variety of different kinds of folks who are doing important work, and the important work that you're doing, Jonathan, with policy that's upstream, I think partners really well with the kind of work that Ben and I do that's maybe more granular, looking at the impacts of climate change on particular species of interest. Today, I'm going to just give you a snapshot of the kind of work that we do in the Midwest Center of Excellence for Vector-borne Disease that I co-direct with Dr. Susan Paskowitz. And I'll start really by saying that I imagine that all of you noticed that of all the pathogenic diseases aggravated by climatic hazards presented by Dr. Patz, 103 of them are vector-borne. So I'm just going to give you a flavor for how climate could impact these systems with a snapshot of climate change implications for mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases in Wisconsin. I'll note too that this work has been pushed ahead by a graduate student, Katie Susong, and by a staff member, Brad Tucker. And to sort of set the stage, I just want you all to know, so you can go away with some fun fact to tell your friends later, that there are 54 different kinds of mosquito in the state of Wisconsin. And the first publication of these was put out in 1867. This chart shows you how the numbers of mosquitoes described has increased over time. One of our graduate students, Lily Ferreira de Freitas, did some sort of Herculean work to figure out how many mosquitoes there are in Wisconsin, and she has landed on this number that's 54. And so mosquitoes are cold-blooded animals. They're totally dependent on a favorable environment to have the appropriate conditions to survive. Some of the mosquitoes that we interact with in Wisconsin are very likely to be very sensitive to the impacts of climate change. And the mosquito I'm showing you here is Aedes provocans. This is, in my mind, this is a beautiful mosquito. I'm a little biased. And I'm going to tell you a little story about her because this is important for those of you who are animal lovers. This mosquito is involved in the transmission of a virus called Jamestown Canyon virus. And it's a mosquito that is what we call an early spring Aedes. And so the pictures that I'm showing you here are from my team. They went up to northern Wisconsin, up by Hayward. That's like the muskie capital of the world, right? And it's really cold up there in April. These mosquitoes actually survive in frozen puddles and emerge just as the snow melts. So they're extraordinarily resistant to cold temperatures. Like our fingers would freeze if we put them in this water. The mosquitoes emerge, and some of the only flowering plants that are out there are those spring ephemerals that are in the forest. I think this is an anemone. Somebody who's a naturalist can correct me. But I also want to point out that mosquitoes are potentially providing some ecosystem services. So this is a male Aedes provocans that looks to be feeding actually on the nectar of this little flower. And if we think about the impacts of climate change and how temperature changes could influence whether this mosquito actually successfully survives, and also like when the spring ephemerals are coming out in the forests. If those things aren't synchronized, there could be impacts for both the mosquito and the plant species. So there are, I think, interesting implications for us to think about in terms of animal health and plant health and human health with just this example. But the mosquito I'm really going to talk about today is Aedes albopictus. So this is, just trust me, this is a beautiful mosquito, but a really persistent issue. So this image comes from a recent issue of Entomology Today that showcased some of the work that Katie and Brad did looking at Aedes albopictus in Wisconsin. It's a really beautiful animal, but it's a real bear. So it's called the Asian tiger mosquito, but I think of it as more of a bear because it's really, really invasive. It's super aggressive. And so when these feed on you, it hurts. It sort of burns your skin. They're pretty nasty, and they're daytime feeders. And so folks who really like to recreate outdoors, be in their backyards, gardening, are really bothered by these mosquitoes in the middle of the day, whereas many of us are used to mosquitoes being more out during the dusk hours. The other thing that's distressing about this mosquito is that it can transmit a number of human pathogens. So something over like 20 different kinds of human pathogens can infect and be transmitted by this mosquito, at least in the lab. So it's a real threat to public health as well. This mosquito probably landed in the US in the 1970s and probably somewhere in southern Florida. And over the decades, it has radiated northward. This image shows you that, that the mosquito in different counties where it's really been detected 3 or more times, that's shown in red. And so you can see that even up in the Midwest, there are states where this mosquito is quite well established. These data go through 2016. We know a lot more now, and the number of counties where this mosquito is established exceeds what's shown here at this point. Back in the 80s, Nauraki et al. Did some work to try and imagine how far this mosquito could expand northwards. And so they kind of knew that these mosquitoes persist over the winter in the egg form, and that the egg was really susceptible to temperatures below -2, for example. And so if the mosquito was exposed to very cold temperatures for a long period of time, and the egg form wouldn't survive. And so they did some very simplistic, although I'm sure it was state-of-the-art sort of modeling back then, and predicted that this line in bold at the top here would be a delimiting spot for the northward expansion of Aedes albopictus. So they've got to have the right conditions in order to survive. Some more recent modeling showed that the mosquito probably could make it even farther northward. And so this effort was done in 2017 with some of our more sophisticated tools for species niche modeling, and suggested that there might even be some counties up in the southern part of Wisconsin where this mosquito could radiate. This was also really important because you may recall that in 2016, we had an outbreak of Zika virus in the United States. This is a mosquito that potentially could be involved in the transmission of Zika. And so people really wanted to know, is this a threat in my backyard? So one of the things that we knew when we set out to try and find this mosquito in Wisconsin is that Aedes albopictus is very often associated with interstate movement of tires. That could be for sale purposes, or it could be because the tires are being moved for recycling. But whatever the case, when a tire moves, it's very likely got mosquitoes in it in some form. And so tires turn out to be a really attractive, irresistible place for some mosquito species to lay their eggs. And tires, you probably know, hold water. And so the water inside a tire is pretty disgusting. It's got plenty of bacteria and fungi and algae and other things growing in it. Turns out to be the perfect sort of nursery for developing mosquito larvae. And so we went looking for tire facilities as a potential clue to where Aedes albopictus could be if it was in Wisconsin. And you may recall that back in 2017, we were featured in several news articles by like the Journal Sentinel, for example, and revealed that in fact in 2 different tire facilities in Wisconsin, one near Monona and one near Milwaukee, we had indeed found Aedes albopictus. So the mosquito was here, but just because it's present doesn't mean that it's here to stay. If it's too cold in the place where the mosquito has invaded, it may not make it through the winter. So we did this enhanced surveillance. This was done with a really outstanding MPH student. Tom Richards and others found this mosquito again in those 2 sites, and they were both in southern Wisconsin. And those detections led us to question, like, so what happens next? Is it possible that this mosquito is here to stay? And so Brad Tucker and Katie Susong did the work to ask this question. So what we did was we raised these mosquitoes in my lab. We induced them into a state of what we call diapause, where they're sort of metabolically quiet in order to survive the winter. And we put them in allotments inside tires. You can see this is an inside of a tire, inside a bag, so they're really well protected. And we put temperature and humidity monitors inside the tire with the mosquito eggs, and also a temperature monitor outside of the tires, so we could tell what ambient external temperatures the environment was experiencing, and then if there was any difference between that and what was going on in the tire. We set 3 tires at each of 5 different sites, and so those spanned from New Berlin, Wisconsin, all the way down to Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And then, so this was happening in the 2018-2019 field season. So we set this out in like October 2018. And then in January, we were hit, you may recall, by a polar vortex. And so it was incredibly cold during the month of January. For a couple weeks at a time. It was a very long, very cold stretch for us. And so we thought, well, that changes the likelihood of our experiment having worked, right? Knowing that this mosquito is really susceptible to temperature. And so we went back and retrieved all of the eggs in April or so, brought them back to the lab, left them out on the lab bench for a while, and then put them in water to see if they would hatch. And the mosquitoes that hatched were mosquitoes only at the northern sites. So this is a list of the sites where the tires were on the left under the location column. On the right, you can see percent survival. And so survival occurred in those places where you see light gray shading. And if you look at the right, you can also see what the temperatures were. And so these are encircled here are temperatures in late January when the polar vortex occurred. It got really, really cold. In the Northwest Mosquito Abatement District, there were days when it was down to -30. So these were very cold temperatures, and we thought, like, wow, this is so strange that these mosquitoes got so cold and yet they survived. So digging a little deeper, we did the work to figure out that, in fact, one of the things that was different between those northernmost sites and the southern sites where no mosquitoes survived was that there was actually snow cover. And so in the northernmost sites, we saw deeper snow cover than we did at the southern sites where the mosquitoes had not survived. And when we plot those data in a pretty way, so you can kind of look at them all together and grok them simultaneously, we can see that the mosquitoes that survived in triangles here were mosquitoes that were exposed to deeper snow, and the temperature inside the tires was warmer. So what we've discovered in all of this is that the tire itself provides a fair bit of insulation on its own, several degrees of insulation, but it was not just the tire, but also the cover of snow that provided sufficient insulating effect for the mosquito eggs to actually survive and hatch the next year. So what we think is that survival and establishment of Aedes albopictus in Wisconsin is probably going to depend on overwintering habitats and places and spaces where these mosquitoes can persist as compared to just outside temperatures. So if you're modeling just outside temperatures, you might get a sort of false understanding of how far this mosquito can go. Working with Dan Vimont and others on campus, we secured some maps to try and think about just that temperature idea and where these mosquitoes could survive. And you can see in 2005 to 2015, places where this mosquito can be comfortably, that's a little anthropomorphic, but those places are south of Wisconsin and down in southern Illinois. And if you've spent time in southern Illinois, you may have been bitten by this mosquito. As I mentioned, it's a real bear. But north of that, then we would think probably only the mosquito could persist in microhabitats. So it would be cold enough that outside of a microhabitat, the mosquito wouldn't survive. And if we look forward to projections from 2046 to 2065, that will change. And so it's very likely, right, that the mosquito will be just fine in parts of southern Wisconsin, and even up in northern Wisconsin, the mosquitoes may survive well in these microhabitats. And so we put forth that microhabitats are really an important area of future study, and we look to people like Ben Zuckerberg, who's going to speak next, to teach us about things like snow cover and subnivium and the habitat that's provided there and how that may shift over time. So it's not as simple as just temperature alone, I think, is my bottom line from this talk. It's temperature and human-induced microhabitats and snow cover and a variety of other things that will dictate how a mosquito succeeds or does not in cold Wisconsin temperatures. So that's what I had for you today. And I'll stop sharing and turn that over to Ben.
Great, thanks very much, Lyric. So our third and final presenter is Ben Zuckerberg. So Ben, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Tony. And thanks everyone for joining. So just as a quick reminder, I'm in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. And so a lot of my program focus tends to think a lot about how species wildlife populations are impacted by modern climate change. And I kind of like to start here in trying to conceptualize this a little bit because a lot of what we tend to do in working with agencies like the DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service is try and estimate or get to some way to think about what species are more or less vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And I think this relates also specifically to, vulnerability to wildlife diseases. In particular, when we think about vulnerability, we try to break it down into sort of two important components. One of them is this idea of sensitivity. And so there clearly are a lot of species out there, and these species have wide variety in terms of their life histories and adaptations. And clearly, in terms of that variety, some species may be more or less sensitive to climate, so that potentially they have differences in their physiology. Maybe they have differences in their behavior or what kind of habitats they can associate with, maybe food resources. And importantly, they may interact with different kinds of species as well. And so all those sort of fall under this umbrella of sensitivity. On the other end of this, however, is exposure. And one important aspect of this is that climate change is a very complex process, right? Not all areas of the world are getting warmer as fast as other areas. We're seeing lots of differences in terms of changes in precipitation. And because of that, certain populations of species are going to be exposed to those differences. Some in terms of the overall changes in those climate components, and others maybe are more or less exposed to the extremes. If we take those two aspects together, sensitivity and exposure, ultimately that kind of feeds into then this idea of vulnerability and how vulnerable a species may be. At the end of the day, we try to focus and try to work with managers to think then what we can do in terms of conservation or management, either sort of reduce that sensitivity of species or reduce their exposure, and then ultimately then reduce that vulnerability. So for today, I'm going to actually kind of talk about one case study that I think captures these two components, sensitivity and exposure, especially when it comes to disease. So going back really until the 1960s or so, and maybe even before that, we've always sort of noticed this sort of phenomenon in many of the Great Lakes, where in 13 years, we get really this high number of carcasses of water birds that kind of come up on shore. And for a long time, this was something of a mystery. And going back, looking at some of this data, you can see in the 1960s, 70s, and so forth, this was something of a fairly common event that every few years or so, we get these massive outbreaks, these massive mortalities of these water birds. And it wasn't just necessarily in Lake Michigan, we started seeing it in other areas as well. And the other really kind of important component or observation here was that we were starting to see it much more frequently, especially happening in the late 90s or so. So a lot of good work has gone into sort of trying to understand what was going on here. And so this really does rely or reside in terms of a mechanism here of avian botulism. And this is really driven by this bacteria that grows in sort of anaerobic or low oxygen conditions. It produces this neurotoxin. And in the Great Lakes, we tend to have these botulism type B events. This neurotoxin, is clearly really problematic for a number of these water birds. It loses sort of their loss of their motor control. It can create what's called the third eyelid paralysis. And it gets a sort of limber neck component where if you're a bird in the water, then clearly as your neck sort of loses control, you kind of start slowly drowning in the water. And this can clearly cause respiratory distress and then eventual death. When we actually start looking at some of those conditions that foster those oxygen poor conditions in the bacteria and potentially the production of this neurotoxin, then a number of scientists have actually shown how over time this can sort of percolate through the food chain. So we can go through crustaceans and invertebrates, and then all the way up into fish are feeding on them. And then even then, you get to higher order birds as well, predators like bald eagles that are feeding on the birds. And so this poses a pretty significant problem because some of the conditions that are sort of perfect then for the formation and the botulism outbreaks tend to be associated with algae, the sort of Cladophria, the type of algae mats, as well as sort of warmer temperatures in the lakes. So we started to explore this a little bit and wanted to try and capture whether or not we can evaluate, quantify the exposure of these bird populations then to the potential conditions that would make it perfect for these types of outbreaks. So we actually looked at satellite imagery. We were going back over several years to see whether or not we can capture this variation in lake temperatures and potentially the presence of algae. And we do this through chlorophyll A. So one of the nice sort of real advantages for looking at satellite imagery is that you can look at this over very large areas. You can look at it in a very sort of spatially complex way and start testing whether or not when you do get these outbreaks, what were the conditions that preceded them? So was there sort of large levels of algae or this chlorophyll A, or are we seeing lake temperatures that were generally warmer? And one of the real findings that came out of this was that in fact, these warmer lake conditions were synchronizing these big outbreaks. So it's not to say necessarily like these outbreaks wouldn't necessarily happen without sort of these conditions, but the idea is that when you have these really warm conditions, it generally synchronized more of these outbreaks happening at a higher magnitude and over larger areas. The other component that we found here is that a number of different species are really affected by these outbreaks. But in terms of that sensitivity, then, what species were most vulnerable? It tended to be these species that were dabbling in sort of shallower areas, shallower water depths. And so clearly, these are species that would be much more vulnerable to those exposed conditions and those outbreaks, and much more likely to be synchronized when they do have these big, massive outbreaks and deaths. So I just wanted to kind of show that as an example of being able to capture these two components of sensitivity and vulnerability. A lot of what I kind of put out there too that we think about is climate change adaptation when we talk about managing wildlife populations. And what I would say is a fair amount of what we do, especially in relation to some of these outbreaks in terms of trying to reduce that vulnerability of species to climate change, tend to talk about and tend to focus on trying to manipulate individuals. So we can try to manage our habitats, but in many cases we translocate them, we reintroduce them, we change our harvest quota, we do this through invasive species control. And a big part of what I think we need to move forward on in terms of wildlife management is thinking about whether or not all these different tools of climate change adaptation can actually in some way influence wildlife disease transmission and exposure. And that's a big sort of component I think we're going to be thinking about moving forward. And I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Lyric and Jonathan as well. We do have a few questions in the chat. If you do have questions, please write them in the chat. So let's go through these, then maybe we can initiate a discussion. So the first one is from Mary Wilson to all of you. So I'll let you decide who answers, but is there vertical transmission of viral pathogens that cause infections in humans in Aedes albopictus mosquitoes?
I think Tom Ewell might like to answer this question too. I thought I saw his name in the list of participants today. Thanks, Mary, for your question. This is one of my favorite questions to ask in a lab. Aedes albopictus, I think there was some data from Bob Tesch's lab long ago in the 80s that showed that there was the possibility of transovarial transmission of some of the dengue serotypes by Aedes albopictus. It's probably not a particularly important sort of approach for the virus to take to be perpetuated. So most of the viruses that I can think of, at least that are transmitted by albopictus regularly, would not be like the epidemiology of those viruses wouldn't be dependent on the transovarial transmission of the virus. But I would say like this mosquito is so susceptible to so many different pathogens and such a good transmitter horizontally that quite a lot of work has gone into understanding the full repertoire of pathogens that mosquito can transmit, and it's a lot. In fact, we often use this mosquito in the lab as a positive control for our infections because it's like so susceptible to everything. Just probably not so much in terms of vertical transmission. But Dr. Ewell, if you're on and you would like to refute that, that is great.
I'm on. I won't refute that.
But by the way, Dr. Ewell is an emeritus professor from our department who spent his career studying vector-borne diseases and mosquitoes.
Sorry, I think everybody knows Tom Ewell.
Okay, Tom, I think you're muted in case you're trying to respond.
Oh, he just said he wouldn't refute that.
Oh, okay, wouldn't refute. Got it. Gotcha. Okay, sorry. So now our next question is from Peter Rockwell. Lyric, it looks like you've captured the day here with mosquito questions. Has there been any recent studies of the northward expansion of Aedes aegypti? And have there been any continued progress interest in subspecies specific targeting of metabolic pathways for pesticides or genetic pathways for precision guidance sterile insect technology? So clearly someone who's not very informed about the details and methodologies in this field.
Wow.
Kidding.
Yes, thanks, Peter. In fact, I just got to organize a meeting in Hawaii. Jonathan, I didn't invite you to that one either, but I just organized a meeting of the Society of Vector Ecology, and I anchored the whole meeting in the idea of planetary health. And one of the sessions we had was on precision controls for mosquitoes, with this idea of really specifically targeting particular species of mosquitoes with new innovative technologies. So to your questions, first, have there been recent studies of northward expansion of Aedes aegypti? The Center of Excellence that I run with Susan Paskowitz is one of 5, or was one of 5, now it's one of 4. And all of us were really charged with trying to understand the range expansion of both Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. So there has been quite a bit of study in this space. And we know that Aedes aegypti, for example, has made its way shockingly far northward in California, and there's quite a bit of aegypti in Florida, and it's a real problem. So, so yes, there has been that study, and it's recognized as really quite important. In terms of progress for sterile insects, we've made a lot of progress, I think, globally using Wolbachia infected mosquitoes. So Jorge Osorio could talk about that a little bit. The Eliminate Dengue program, or now World Mosquito Program, uses Wolbachia infected mosquitoes as one approach to try and suppress Aedes aegypti populations. That seems to be working quite well. There's another company called Oxitec that has some technology that's tetracycline dependent driven sterile insect technique for Aedes aegypti. Those mosquitoes are being tried in the Florida Keys. So Oxitec is testing its product in the Florida Keys. And there's just a ton of really exciting progress related to CRISPR and genome editing. And so I think the tools available for Aedes aegypti control are on the move for sure. And I'm happy to share literature with you or contacts if you'd like to learn more about that, Peter.
Thanks, Lyric. There's another Dr. Bartholomay question here, but I'm going to skip it for a moment so that Ben stays engaged. So this is from Jacqueline Houtman. Dr. Zuckerberg addressed the issue of vulnerability to avian botulism and dabbling ducks. Oh, sorry, this is a Jonathan question. Can Dr. Patz address the issue of human vulnerabilities to zoonotic diseases as they are affected by climate change, poverty, occupation, housing conditions, for example?
That's a great question, Jacqueline. And certainly with vector-borne diseases, housing has a lot to do with it. Think about the poor housing, the informal housing in Brazil and favelas. And when they had the, after that strong El Nino of 2015-16, where Dan Weimont recorded temperatures higher than 2 standard deviations above a 60-year average, there was a massive dengue fever epidemic, and that's when Zika arose as well. And the vectorial capacity was super high as far as temperature effects on Aedes aegypti ability to transmit these viruses. But who's most vulnerable? If you've got screens on windows and air conditioning, you are in a completely different situation than if you're in informal housing without any protection. So it's a big deal. It's also a big deal with waterborne diseases and thinking about housing people that live in formerly red-lined neighborhoods that are much higher risk of having their house flooded and then exposure to mold and risk of asthma. So huge, it's a great question, and it's a big problem as far as equity and exposure to these diseases that are climate sensitive.
You're on mute, Dr. Goldberg.
I'm sorry, I am now unmuted. So here's one I think, Ben, you might be able to address. This is from Shirley Sword. What's the role or priority of maintaining biodiversity as we try to learn more about the impacts of climate change globally and how to mitigate its progression, if that is even still possible?
Yeah, it's a good question in the sense, I mean, especially when there's been a lot of work on things like the dilution effect in terms of how disease transmission happens and how biodiversity can help sort of be a natural buffer to some of that transmission. And it's a controversial topic in some settings, but it's a really kind of interesting concept. So in many cases, I think people think about biodiversity, especially when we think about these ideas of climate-mediated disease transmission sort of being a really important component of trying to preserve, to help almost the natural immune system of an ecosystem to be able to deal with those things. So yeah, I mean, I would continue to think about biodiversity as being something that we continue to strive for managing. At the same time, I think we do a fair amount of, at least in my field in wildlife work, in terms of trying to understand and predict and basically come to grips with the fact that many of these species are going to be changing, that they're going to be shifting in terms of their ranges, shifting in terms of their phenology, shifting in terms of their activities, even throughout the course of a day. And so being able to sort of accommodate that change and help transition that change and knowingly sort of make predictions about those changes in biodiversity, I think is a really important aspect of climate change adaptation. We can't necessarily build, resilient walls around some of these ecosystems. We know that there's going to be shifts in these communities, and maybe even the emergence of sort of what's referred to as no analog communities, communities that we've never really seen sort of before, and trying to then estimate sort of what we can do about it in terms of mediating its impact.
If I can quickly just add, Tony, whenever you change an ecosystem, be it from climate or from land use change, you change the biodiversity. We conducted a study in the Peruvian Amazon and found that deforestation completely changed the mosquito biodiversity and favored the more dangerous mosquito in that region that carries malaria. So, disruption of changing biodiversity can do all sorts of things as far as changing risk. And I'd like to push this question to you, Tony, because there are pluses and minuses of biodiversity, and I just wonder what's your opinion about this question.
Hey, I didn't agree to that. No, it's a good question, and it leads into a question that I was going to pose to the group. My answer is, and this is a classic waffling academic answer. It depends, because in some cases biodiversity is good, in some cases it's bad, in some cases it's neither. So it depends on the particular system, and it's very complicated. So one of the questions that I've gotten from a lot of people lately, and Jonathan, you often say that in the realm of climate change, there are winners and losers. So there are populations of people, for example, or animals that are clearly going to suffer due to climate change, and populations that will actually do better. So clearly, climate change is one of the great challenges of our time, if not the greatest challenge of our time, and something that we must reverse if at all possible. But within that context, I wonder if each of you would be willing to give an example of a winner, a human population, for example, that might do better with climate change, or a disease that might go away, or an animal population that might benefit. Not to say that climate change is good, but just to sort of keep with this balanced view that there are winners and losers. Jonathan?
Yeah, well, I'll go straight to this recent report where we identified 218 out of 375 human diseases that are exacerbated by climate change. Two in particular that stand out that are favored by colder temperatures are influenza and rotavirus. So influenza and rotavirus, they may decrease with warming of the planet. But I do want to just push back a little bit about something, and I'll say that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that has been assessing the risk of climate change for every 5 years for the last 6 assessment reports, look at winners and losers, and more and more the losers, as far as on balance, there's much more risk than benefit. You're muted, Tony.
Any thoughts, Lyric or Ben? Well, if not, then we do have another question in the chat from Rebecca Alcock to the group at large, which follows on Jacqueline's question. Is there any evidence demonstrating that women are and will be disproportionately affected by the health effects of climate change, given social positioning, unpaid labor expectations, subsistence farming responsibilities, et cetera, in some cultures? Or do we anticipate that the health consequences will be shared equally between men and women?
Well, I'll just say that it's a great question, and the question is so good that the answer is in the question because, women are disproportionately affected. They are the outdoor laborers in many agricultural societies. They are at a much higher risk in many ways. So, there is an issue there.
Any thoughts from our other panelists?
I'll add a couple other very quick direct ones. There's a study that shows that sea level rise in East Asia, with salt intrusion in the aquifers increases the risk of preeclampsia, which is a risk for women.
Lyric, were you about to offer a comment?
Oh, only that I wish Lori Dupree Brown was here because I'm sure she would have a very articulate response to this question.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay, so I see no other impending questions in the chat. So I'm wondering if each of our panelists would be willing to offer a thought, idea, or opinion that they want to share, but that hasn't come up in the course of the discussion. And it's not voluntary. We're going to start with Jonathan, then Lyric, then Ben, and go and have them each have a final word.
Okay, yeah. So I think I have a question, and it's about disease prevention. When we look at the environmental determinants and we go upstream in the causal pathway, are we focusing our interventions and surveillance at the right place when we're detecting the first human case? And in the case of, everyone here, we, in the vet school, we are looking at animal cases, wildlife disease, but are we even going far enough upstream? And maybe this is a question to Ben, that to look at how well do we understand the changes in ecosystems as perturbed by either climate extremes or human intrusion, and being able to mark risks at the ecosystem level. I think that's a blind spot.
Lyric, any thoughts? And I inadvertently skipped over one of Tom Muell's questions, which is whether ticks are as equally sensitive to temperature and humidity as Aedes albopictus are.
Okay, so that's what I'll spend my time on then, is ticks, and maybe connect back to Ben's work too. So I think one of the things that I just heard about at this meeting that I mentioned was that Janet Foley put out a paper on tick invasion biology and trends in parasitology that we should all read, because when we think about ticks, we're often focused on, and rightfully so, on Ixodes scapularis. That's the tick that transmits the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. It's a really important vector of human disease, and it's one where One Health is really well illustrated because the bacterium depends on infecting small mammals like mice and then gets into the tick. And so any impacts on small mammals that feed young ticks and on deer that feed the older ticks really impact the whole disease ecology system. And we had a really excellent graduate student in entomology doing important research to understand where the right mice are in Wisconsin that are the best hosts for Ixodes scapularis, and the impacts of climate change are likely to be felt in that system, but it's probably more because of impacts on the host itself. So where Wisconsin becomes inhospitable to Peromyscus species, we'll certainly see impacts on disease transmission dynamics. Those ticks are also really, really interesting in terms of their environmental resistance and sensitivities. They're so cold tolerant, and they can really persist in the leaf litter in remarkably cold temperatures. But tying back then to work that Ben and some of his colleagues in forest and wildlife ecology do, there may be threats to the survival of that tick if the ground isn't properly covered by snow, and it looks like their projections that snow cover will change quite a lot in the coming years. So that was a academic mouthful, sorry, but brings us back, I think, to Ben and the importance of us doing work where we're looking at Jonathan's scale, right, and thinking about how we mitigate climate change as a whole, and then at my scale where we're looking at vectors and pathogen transmission, and at Ben's scale where we're looking at the things those vectors depend on feeding on in order to persist.
Thanks. We're almost out of time. Ben, do you have any thoughts so we can end the session on disease?
I'll just say that maybe two quick thoughts. One is that it's very complex. When we talk about, they're talking about, the future of winters in the Midwest, it's going to be twofold. It's going to be warmer winters, certainly, but it's also going to be those with less snow cover. And so you have these two kind of factors that are potentially interacting that are going to influence something like mosquitoes or ticks. And then probably the other component too is that I'd hate for us to just think about climate change in isolation, that there's been, this idea that habitat loss and climate change are really the anthropogenic cocktail that species have to basically survive in. And it's really interacting and being synergistic in many ways in how species are going to move, how they're going to interact with one another, and how it's going to affect the entire ecosystem, like Don was saying.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So interaction, complexity, but perhaps predictability. So we hope. So, okay, I think we're going to end it there in the interest of time, but I want to thank our panelists very much for taking the time to speak with us this evening. And I also would like to encourage everyone to check out the schedule for upcoming Global Health Tuesdays, where we're going to have additional thought-provoking sessions on various relevant topics to global health. So thank you very much, and see you on our next Tuesday meeting.